Hi, you're on the Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouse. We get together every Sunday night from 8 until 10 p.m. usually, sometimes a little longer, sometimes a little shorter. And we look at life through a biblical lens. We do it together. We've got folks in the chat room and you can pay attention. We've got other ways later on. You can watch this. You catch it on YouTube. You can catch it on Facebook. We're broadcasting live now on sermonaudio.com. We've got Ustream.tv. You get the camera, you get the pictures on my website, thebibleforum.net. Every week, you just go there and they'll just run through that. And there's a couple other different ways we do it. Just want to let you have an opportunity to jump in here. I want to talk to you about the coronavirus thing that's going on. Do you think it's a manufactured crisis? Brandon Smith, writing for something called the Activist Post, tells us that in the past 6 months, the media seems to be trying to rewrite the history of the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu came in 1918. It was the deadliest epidemic in history. About a third of the world's population died. They try to rewrite the history of it as if martial law measures were a success, even though ultimately the flu ran its natural course in the majority of U.S. cities. Infections and deaths continued unabated until the virus burned itself out and disappeared. No working vaccine was ever produced, though there were many failed attempts based on the assumption that the disease was bacterial. Martial law actions only serve to drag out the timeline of the virus. Now, one could argue that 100 years ago, governments didn't have the same tools at their disposal that they do now. But are we really that much farther ahead? Virologists have been working on an effective SARS vaccination or vaccine for almost 20 years and have had no success. The idea that they would come up with a working vaccine for COVID in the span of a year, which is what governments are suggesting, seems absurd. History shows us that when vaccines are rushed into production by authorities, very bad things happen. Regardless of lockdown measures, infection rates, the fact that they continue to climb in many nations seems to justify even longer or more frequent lockdowns. All this creates an endless cycle of economic instability, which the public really can't endure. And many people are beginning to wonder what purpose there is to these pandemic restrictions. It's obviously not to slow the virus and save lives, as an effective vaccine is unlikely to be developed in time for the lockdowns to matter. But if you wanted to quickly implement a totalitarian system, then using a global health threat as justification might be the ticket. The problem for the establishment would be this: how can they keep the tyranny going once they have it? Ultimately, for a totalitarian system to work, it needs a large portion of the public to support it on principle. The public has to believe that the loss of their liberties is absolutely necessary to their survival for the long term. What I find most interesting in this disparity in response to the two sides of the crisis today is that just as in the early part of the 20th century, we have a communist uprising and a global pandemic, of which the public is growing increasingly suspicious. For example, the law enforcement response to the BLM, the Black Lives Matter, and Antifa riots has been rather subdued and passive. They're getting more aggressive now, but I believe it's because property owners and others are screaming bloody murder. The author of this piece says he was in Pittsburgh for the G20 event in 2009 and can tell us from experience that the police response there was vicious and highly coordinated. And they were going up against groups that were doing nothing more than chanting slogans in the street without a permit from the city. The city government only gave out one protest permit, when the G20 were there in Pittsburgh. There were no rioting and minimal damage to private property. Yet law enforcement deployed full-force measures, including Spartan formations, sound cannons, rubber bullets, armored vehicles. Now, if you watch the video footage of the G20 in Pittsburgh and then compare it to the riots in Portland, Seattle, Minneapolis, New York, it becomes very clear that for some reason police are being ordered to hold back the majority of the time. Another glaring issue is the media's response to those riots. They refer to the protests as exclusively peaceful, despite mass looting, destruction of private property, and violence. They treat the BLM as sacrosanct and untouchable and act as an attack dog against anyone criticizing the actions of that organization. The issue of social distancing and virus spread is dismissed or ignored when it comes to BLM. I don't see a lot of masks on the people on the street. By extension, examine the mainstream media's response to the protests against coronavirus lockdown restrictions. No riots, no looting, no violence on the part of conservative and moderate protesters. And yet the media demonizes them as if they are a threat to the very fabric of our society. Look at how quick authorities have been to arrest people who refuse to follow lockdown restrictions, and take into account how aggressive arrests have been made in other countries like Australia, Spain, or the UK for doing nothing more than posting messages on Facebook or not wearing a mask on the street. Are you getting the picture? Why are they so keen to allow the BLM riots to continue? Can it be a two-pronged attempt, a bait and switch? You see, if the Marxists are successful and meet little resistance from the public, then they will tear down the current system, and the elitists or institutions that fund them, like the George Soros Open Society Foundation or the Ford Foundation, will use the opportunity to build an Orwellian collectivist society from the ashes. Did I mention Bill Gates? On the other hand, as in Germany in the 1930s, the civil unrest caused by several hard left groups, could also convince the general public that martial law measures are an acceptable solution and make people willing to sacrifice constitutional protections in order to rid themselves of the threat. There have been examples of this recently when federal agents initiated black bagging of protesters in Portland using unmarked vans. Initially, all we saw from most conservatives was cheering. This would undoubtedly lead to a long-term totalitarian structure. Once began, benefits the elites that inhabit every aspect of government. In both cases, the power elites get what they want, a police state. In terms of the pandemic response, a police state is already being established in many nations. And with most Western peoples predominantly disarmed, there is little chance they'll be able to resist the crackdown that will ensue as they try to protest the restrictions. But what about America? Is this why the BLM riots are being encouraged so openly in the U.S.? Look at it this way. If the elites cannot get us to go along with medical tyranny for fear of sparking an armed uprising from conservatives with actual training and ability, then they figure maybe they can trick us into supporting martial law in the name of defeating the political left. And it all makes sense. The only solution is to refuse to support either option. We must repel the establishment of medical tyranny and stand against any overstep of state and or federal governments against the Constitution when it comes to protest. Riots and looting can be dealt with, and dealt with within the confines of the Bill of Rights. Now keep in mind, in almost every place where armed citizens organize and take up security measures in their communities, the protests remain peaceful. Either that or they don't happen at all. There is no legitimate excuse for a police state. There is always another way. And anybody who tells you different has an agenda of their own. Things are going to get a little strange before they get better.